Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Straight Goods. I'm your host, Brian Lee Crowley, where we're discussing today school performance and accountability here in the Maritimes. My two guests, Charles Cirtwill and Alan Parry. Alan, before the break, we were talking a little bit about the experience in the Edmonton public schools, and I'm going to stop and sort of underline public schools, because a lot of people who might share your view that the problem with the public schools is that they're a monopoly. A lot of people think that, well, the only possible solution to that is kind of to opt out of the public system, you know, to go to private school, and of course that's not accessible to many people, and they think, well, what's this got to do with those of us who want good public schools? But the Edmonton experience that you're talking about has transformed the public schools in Edmonton, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, well, there weren't any, well, there were a few, I guess, independent schools way back in the 70s. And they grew in the 80s, actually. There was a lot of, Alberta introduced charter schools, which I think is basically a good thing, because it gives the public school system things to aim at. It breaks that monopoly feeling down a little bit. But in the last 10 years, I think that Edmonton public schools have been worked very hard to make public schools the place that people want to go. And in fact, they've brought back enrollment from these independent schools back into the public system.
In fact, I believe I'm saying, because we had Angus Macbeth, the superintendent of the public schools in Edmonton, out here to speak 2 summers ago, I think. And it seems to me that Angus said that there were a couple of independent or private schools that had actually been brought into the public system. In other words, they said, gee, you know, we would like to be part of what you're doing in the public schools. It looks like you have the same concerns of quality and so on that we do, and why would we charge fees when we can give access to what we're doing to the entire school population of Edmonton?
You're absolutely right, Brian. In fact, one of the most fascinating statistics for me when we had Angus come and talk was Angus said that Edmonton is the only public system in the country or the only education system in the country where private school enrollment is declining.
Yeah.
And for this region in particular, where we've seen an explosion basically in private schools, because everybody has this intuitive sense that the public system is in trouble. I think it's a very powerful message that the people who want to maintain a high-quality public system should be paying attention to.
Yeah, and there's really no reason at all why a public school can't be every bit as good as a privately funded one. In fact, we were kind of affronted by the fact that people would feel a need to have a private school, because why should they pay taxes twice? They were paying taxes to the public school system, as well as paying fees to have their child educated in the private system. So we figured we should give them some competition.
Well, that's why you focused at the very beginning on this notion of the public schools being a monopoly, because that was really what you saw as the key problem.
And one of the very early things we did was to create some alternatives within the public system. So, for example, one of the schools that I remember I had a hand in starting was a very small high school with about 250 kids, Old Scona, in an old building in the south part of Edmonton. And everybody said it was too small to be a high school and all that kind of stuff. And we said, well, we'll make it a very narrowly focused high school, focused on academic excellence. And I can never forget the first night there was a parent-teachers meeting when the principal came into my office the following day and said, "Oh, I can't believe what happened last night." I said, "What happened, Leif?" And he said, it was like a big celebration. And I said, "Does that surprise you? We got all the kids who wanted to perform really well, and the parents who wanted to do it, and the teachers wanted to teach a school like that. And we put them all in one place. I mean, hell, it just had to take off," and it did. And that gave all the other high schools something to aim at, because this small 250 kids with no more financial support per capita than the other schools were getting, was blowing the doors off and leaving the others in their dust, and the others didn't like it, so they followed them.
Sorry, Charles, do you want to leave it here?
That in fact gets at the second, what I consider the second largest boogeyman of education reform, and that's the whole, well, they have more money than us, so we can't be expected to do the same things that they do. And I'm absolutely ecstatic to hear somebody from Alberta say it's not about how much money or the advantages in money. It's about how you spend that money and doing productive things with the money you have. Because, of course, we consistently get into this sidebar debate in the public environment about, well, who's got the most money per capita? Is our province spending more money than the other provinces? Is our board getting as much money as that board? And it distracts you. It distracts you from your day-to-day responsibilities of delivering education. And it strikes me that if we spent some of that energy focusing on actually doing our jobs better, we might not be so worried about how much money we had to do.
It's rather interesting the way things are done in education in conventional systems, because people spend all their, so much of their creative energy fighting to get more money. And when they actually get it, I wonder how much creativity they've got and energy they've got left to figure out how to spend it. Because the way that the system worked was that the central office people heard a budget, the board approved it, and then the central office specialists dribbled the money up to the schools. And the schools then spent a tremendous amount of their time trying to get more from central office administrators. What we said was, when we turned around, was, here's your money to the school. That's all there is. There isn't any more because we've given it all out. In fact, Edmonton spends 92% of the money in Edmonton is controlled in the school. About $500 million budgets.
And then 82% of that is controlled in the individual
schools. Right, in the individual schools. So then they can say, well, look, don't come spending your energy fighting for more, because there isn't any more. It's all out there. And so how would you like to go to work? To spend the time with your teachers and parents, trying to figure out how to get the biggest bang for the buck when you're spending that money that you've got. And we had that problem with originally I started with a seven school pilot, and we piloted this stuff for about 3 years before we unleashed it on the rest of the system. And that was the big problem at the beginning of the schools saying, well, how much are we going to get more than you guys? And I said, look, there isn't any more. This is all we've got. So how would you guys like to agree on how you're going to divvy up the $8.5 million, which is what it was then in 75 terms? And after they did that, then they went away and spent all their time working with their teachers to figure out how to spend it for the benefit of the kids, which is where the energy ought to be spent. I mean, the money belongs to the kids. They shouldn't have to fight to get it.
All right, well, look, we could spend a lot of time talking about Edmonton, because I think it's such a great model of what the public schools could be. But I want to come back, if I could, to the school report card here and the challenges in arriving at a reasonable and intelligible picture of what actually goes on in the schools. Now, a question I'd like both of you to speak to just for a minute is, how fair is it to measure the performance of schools who do something as difficult and hard to quantify as educating kids? Is it fair? Can you do it in a way that's reasonable? Charles, why don't you start?
My off-the-cuff response to that is it's unfair not to. What they do is so important that to not have some core measurable performance indicators is a fundamental failure of our public trust. And is it fair to measure? Absolutely, it's fair to measure. And there are things that we can measure, and things that the vast majority of the people most concerned about education can agree on are the right things to measure. Are we ever going to agree on all the things that we could measure? No. But the core is there, and I think we can all agree on that and move forward.
Alan, what do you think?
Well, I just don't believe there's any question about whether or not it's reasonable to find out whether kids are learning stuff. We force the kids to go to school for 12 years. We force the parents to send them there. The parents have it. I think that the school systems and education has an obligation to let parents know how well the kids are doing and whether or not they're learning something. And the ironic thing, of course, is that teachers, and there's a lot of good teachers out there, spend an awful lot of their time marking papers and giving the kids a mark. If they don't believe in measurement, why are they doing that? They know innately that if they didn't give the kids some feedback, and if they didn't give the kids a mark, and the kids didn't know how well they were doing, it would be very difficult for the kids to know whether they were okay or they should try harder next week or what have you. So there's got to be a reason that they give the kids a mark in the first place. It's like having a hockey game if you decided not to count the goals and didn't have a league. How much interest would there be in watching the game or even playing it, perhaps? I don't know. So I think it's one of those how many angels can fit on the head of the pin question about whether or not you should give kids feedback on how well they're doing.
Well, Charles, what Alan just said reminded me a little bit of the four ministers of education actually commissioned a report on the Ames report card.
And I was thinking that direct quote. They hired a former assistant deputy minister of the Department of Education from one of the regions to do a review of our report card. And this gentleman, very sensible, very sound academic, who made sure that he had the independence an academic requires to do a fair analysis. And it was fascinating that in a report that was basically purchased with the intent of attacking our report card and indicating that our methodology was flawed, he spent about 80% of his time attacking the provinces for their failure to report, for not putting the information out there, for not in fact doing this before we had done it. And the wonderful quote was, he didn't understand how and Brian, you can help me with the exact language here, but it was along the lines of how a system that spends its time marking and measuring students does not believe that same approach should apply to them, was just mind-boggling for him.
Sure.
And he put that as the lead to his conclusion in this report, saying, it's just exactly as you put it out. You guys do this every day. Why is it right for you to do it to others and not have it done to you?
Yeah, and the notion of giving schools the money without having a system of measuring results in place, I would believe is pretty irresponsible. Because if you don't have a system for measuring outcomes, not only in terms of student performance, but also in terms of student satisfaction and parental satisfaction and staff morale, staff satisfaction, then basically what you run the risk of is giving away the farm. And we had 180 principals in those days in our schools, and if you'd just given enough the money and say, well, spend it as you will, I mean, we'd been going off in 180 different directions, and we could never have pulled it back.
You'd end up with the health system which we have, which
you
spends $80 billion and has no accountability.
That's exactly what it is. And any time that there's a problem with accountability, one or two things will go out of control, and it's either results or resources. And you figured out, what's gone out of control in health and what's going out of control in education, in areas where they don't measure outcomes. I think in education it's probably biased towards the results of not being as stellar as it should be. And in health, of course, I think the resources are completely gone out of control to the point where we're on the verge of bankruptcy and we don't even know it yet, or won't admit it.
Now, Charles, you said that there's a lot of controversy over what the right things are to measure. We've got about a minute before the break. You've talked about the things you can measure. Mm-hmm. Talk about the things you can't but wish you could.
Oh, well, to be quite honest, I think we have the core. I think we're close to the core measures. We've got a measure of academic achievement. We've got a measure of engagement in the educational process. I think in terms of the core, there's some things we'd like to fill in. For example, we've got all these standardized testing results kicking around out there, but only in 2 of the 4 Atlantic provinces and 1 of the Maritime provinces we have the ability to actually put standardized tests and teacher-assigned grades.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're about to head for our break, but when we come back, we're going to talk more about this issue of testing. It's always a big issue whenever we talk with parents and the media and the public about the schools is, what's the right way to test? Are tests valid? That's an important issue for us to address when we come back right after this break. See you then.